Steve Jobs, founder of Apple, loved music. And in some ways, his direction at Apple helped save the music business with the iTunes Music Store. But when it launched in 2003, there were some notable artists missing from the service. For one, the Beatles, who Jobs adored.
When the Beatles, when they were together, they did truly brilliant, innovative work. And when they split up, they did good work, but it was never the same.
It wasn't until 2010 that the Beatles released their catalog to iTunes. Of all the big hits the band had over the decades, their first best-selling song on the US iTunes charts wasn't previously a number one. It was a non-single, the beloved and revered Here Comes the Sun. And still, nearly a decade after the Beatles made their songs available on iTunes, and 50 years after the song itself was created, Here Comes the Sun is keeping up with the times.
Play the top songs by the Beatles.
Playing the top songs by the Beatles on Amazon Music.
In this video, we're taking a look at the story behind the classic George Harrison track on the Beatles' Abbey Road, Here Comes the Sun.
Here comes the sun, do-do-do. Here comes the sun.
How Here Comes the Sun was written is a beautiful little story, and it starts in the backyard of George Harrison's neighbor in the first part of 1969. Hurtwood Edge is the name of Eric Clapton's estate, purchased in the late 60s for just £30,000. The estate was about a 30-minute drive from George and Patty Harrison's home in Esher. Clapton describes the grounds at Hurtwood in his autobiography. When I walked around the garden, I was amazed to find 5 or 6 fully grown redwoods there, which I imagine must have been hundreds of years old and planted long before the place was built. What I liked most about Hurtwood was the solitariness and the peace. It was here that Harrison wrote the song In the Presence of the Guitar God.
It was one of those beautiful spring mornings. I think it was April. We were just walking around the garden with our guitars, and the sun was shining, and it was a beautiful morning, and he started to sing. Here Comes the Sun, and the opening lines, you know.
Clapton continued the story in his book by saying George fleshed it out bit by bit until it was lunchtime. Harrison told David Wigg later that year,
and it was just really nice sunny day, and I picked up the guitar, which was the first time I'd played the guitar for a couple of weeks because I'd been so busy, and the first thing that came out was that song. It just came, and I finished it later when I was on holiday in Sardinia.
There's more to the story, though. It wasn't just the peace and sunshine of that day that inspired George. It was how this peace and sunshine came when there had been little of it in George's life. First, as for the weather, the previous winter had been especially dreary, even by English standards. It's been a long, cold, lonely winter wasn't fiction. Beyond that, George was in the middle of some personal battles. He had recently had his tonsils taken out, been arrested for drugs, and learned his mother had terminal cancer. And there was also business trouble. As noted in my series on the Beatles' rooftop gig, George left the band a few months prior. He returned, but this didn't remotely resolve the business and creative turbulence within the group. We are lucky we got Here Comes the Sun instead of something really dark. It's like he wrote it to console himself. When George sings, "It's all right," we can believe that he means it.
I just write a song and it just comes out however it wants to. To me, they're just songs, things that are there that have to be got out.
A final note on the lyrics. This part is practically universally known, but at one point, George thought of this bit as Scooby-Dooby, as this undated handwritten lyric sheet shows. There's more to Here Comes the Sun than its lyrics, though. Besides live performances, all of what we know about the music of Here Comes the Sun comes from the master recording. Unlike many other Beatles compositions, certainly ones of this era, there are no demos or early takes of Here Comes the Sun currently available. Now that may change with future releases, like, say, an Abbey Road box set. I'm not going to analyze the music theory of this song, but in the description for this video, I'll link to some excellent resources that really detail things, like this video from Beatles scholar Aaron Kadovich.
But the meter of Here Comes the Sun is inconsistent.
But there are a few musical details that George Harrison brings our attention to. First, Here Comes the Sun is musically related to another of George's Beatles tunes.
If I needed someone.
I'm no Eric Clapton when it comes to playing, but check this out. Harrison himself mentioned the similarities. It's a bit like if I needed someone, like that basic sort of riff going through it. It's the same as all those Bells of Rhymney sort of bird-type things. And another glance at the lyric sheet shows that George was thinking of Badge, a song he co-penned with Clapton months prior. Can you hear the resemblance? On to the studio. Here Comes the Sun was completed over the course of 6 sessions at EMI, where studios 1, 2, and 3 were all used. The first parts were recorded on the 7th of July, 1969. Take 13, the final take of the day, was chosen as best, and this became the backing track. It's comprised of drums by birthday boy Ringo Starr, Paul's effortless-sounding bass line, and George's work for the day, a scratch vocal and an acoustic part with his Gibson J200, likely the one shown here. A quick aside, and back to the dicey business situation for the band. Author Peter Doggett writes that manager Alan Klein showed up at one of these first sessions for the song to discuss a tense contract situation. Thankfully, this didn't disrupt the song's progress. Even author Mark Lewison points out that good-natured banter can be heard on the session tapes. The next few studio dates would see new vocal and guitar takes and other additions, including harmonium, extra drumming, and manually double-tracked vocals. Some of this stuff is buried in the mix, and some of it is right up front.
Sun, 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 here it comes.
Unlike most harmonies on Beatles records, this one is missing someone, John Lennon. He doesn't appear at all in EMI's notes for the Here Comes the Sun sessions. Lennon was recovering from a car accident on the 1st of July, receiving 14 stitches and a 5-day stay in the hospital. Nevertheless, some fans claim they hear John in the harmonies, or they heard through the grapevine that he was there for the hand clap overdubs. Take that for whatever it's worth. Alan Parsons, tape operator for the session, told author Andy Babuke that someone else did join Paul, George, and Ringo for the hand claps, but this was Glenn Johns, who, quote, dropped out because he kept screwing up. The studio session on the 15th of August took place exactly 1 week after the Abbey Road cover photo was taken. This session welcomed orchestral players for 5 of the Abbey Road album tracks, including Here Comes the Sun. Now let's talk about some really fun stuff. First, there are 2 bits that weren't used on the final track. Mark Lewison writes that there were tape loops considered for the song on August 5th. At least for now, we don't know what these sounded like, but it's really interesting to imagine. There's also the quote-unquote lost solo, which was released as part of the 2011 Martin Scorsese documentary on George Harrison. I won't play it here, but I'll link to it in the description. Proceed with caution. I listened to it once, and it's hard to unhear. This solo did not make the cut, and in my opinion, for a good reason. It just doesn't fit the song. But there is an electric guitar part in the mix that does blend right in. Neither Recording Sessions nor Chronicles mentions it, but it's there, and it sounds like it was played through a Leslie speaker. In the epic book Recording the Beatles, the authors include this part on the 8-track tape. Also seen here is the presence of the Moog synthesizer. A quick pronunciation note, by the way, from its inventor.
Well, there are 3 ways of pronouncing M-O-O-G. Moog, Moog. I just happen to like the sound of Moog better than Moog.
In November of 1968, George Harrison bought one of the earliest synthesizers available, a Moog 3P. Now, this was way before modern digital synths, and as George Harrison said, it was enormous, with hundreds of jack plugs and 2 keyboards. Although the P in 3P stood for portable, this thing was unwieldy, and as such occupied its own room at EMI Studios, room 43. John Lennon was interviewed by Tony MacArthur in September of 1969 and talked about the new album. He mentioned George and the Moog.
Yeah, George can work it a bit, I mean, it'll take you all your life to learn all the variations on it. But George has got one.
George Harrison recorded his Moog part on the 19th of August, 1969. An interesting note about the Moog from Eddie Veale, with whom I spoke in 2018 for my short film about the Beatles' Esher demos. Veale was a close associate of Bob Moog, as well as Mike Vickers, seen here with the Beatles and the instrument in Room 43. During the sessions for Here Comes the Sun, Veale was called in by EMI studio staff to assist.
Yeah, because I was looking after the synthesizers over here for Bob, and got a call from Abbey Road that there was a fault on a synthesizer on a session, which I went and had a look at, and it was one that George brought over from the States. And that was the time I met George. And that was actually a keyboard fault that it lost its sustain. So played a note on the keyboard, took your finger off, and it would glide down to the lowest note. That was used on, that fault was actually used on Here Comes the Sun.
This is a story I've never read or heard about, but Eddie, he's a trustworthy source. For some reason, he's not quoted in many Beatles-related books, but remarkably, he led the installations of the professional home studios for both George at Friar Park and John Lennon at Tittenhurst.
Eddie Veale! He's on the floor here. Get him up.
Accolades abound for Here Comes the Sun, and perhaps the best come from inside the Beatles family. For one, producer George Martin called Here Comes the Sun, in some ways, one of the best songs ever written. On Abbey Road, the song begins side 2. If you haven't listened to this album on vinyl, you really should. It's a different experience. After the intensity and weight of I Want You, She's So Heavy at the end of side 1, you get to decide when to flip the record and virtually bask in the sunshine of Here Comes the Sun. Even without this dramatic effect, though, the song seems to perpetually speak to new generations. In 2016, streaming service Spotify detailed how users listen to the Beatles. Here Comes the Sun was the top Beatles track for listeners 17 and younger, and a close second for those between 18 and 24. Here Comes the Sun is uplifting, it's optimistic, and these feelings come through in both word and tune. Even the recording is a masterpiece. And that has connected with multiple generations spanning 50 years. George Harrison wrote an enduring favorite, and this isn't likely to change anytime soon. Hello, it's Lance, and before you go, this is important because it's about my wife. These videos take a long time to put together. My wife has an awesome amount of patience as I weave everything together, so I think it could go a long way if you would just say hey to her or maybe thank you in the comments if you enjoyed this video. Another way to show your appreciation for this channel and what I'm up to is, of course, to subscribe to the channel or hit that like button for this video. You can also see what I've got going on patreon.com/FabFourArchivist. All right, that's it for this one. See y'all next time.